Hello, Taylor Elwood here, and welcome to the Men's Mysteries podcast. Every other week, I have an episode where I interview a guest. This week's guest is Kristal DeSantis, author of the book Strong. We're going to be talking all about how men can become better at relationships. This was a pivotal book that I read that transformed my life and helped me step into better relationship with myself so that I could be in better relationship with people in general, but specifically with potential romantic partners. And it has helped me significantly show up in the relationship that I'm in now. Now, as you know, every other week I do a monologue where I talk about a topic that is relevant to you about men's health, about relationship skills, and about how to become the leader of your life. And all of that is part of the Sovereign Code. And every other week, I have a guest like Kristal on. And what I'd love for you to do is whether you're on YouTube or on the Men's Mystery Substack, I'd love for you to comment on this podcast, like it, share it, restack it, let other people know about it because this is the kind of content that helps transform your life and helps you show up to become the best possible man you can be. And I want you to have the relationships that you want. I want you to be the sovereign of your life. And this is part of where we start. We get this, we look at all the different resources that are available to us. So without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome Kristal DeSantis. Welcome to the Men's Mysteries podcast. I'd love it if you could take a few moments and introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm Kristal DeSantis, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in Texas. And I'm also an author of the book Strong, a relationship field guide for the modern man. And yeah, that's what I'm really passionate about is helping people, specifically men, improve their relationships. And it is a field that I have loved working in for the past decade.
Yeah, so right before we got on, of course, I showed you my copy of your book, which has been well loved. In fact, if people see,
Yeah,
you can see how you can see that there's multiple tags and there's lots of underlines in here. I read your book. I read your book actually in the wake of a breakup because I was kind of like, all right, I'd already been doing men's work for a couple years at that point, so I knew some of the stuff, but I was like, there's some areas here that I need to work on and take responsibility for. And so I had happened to hear your podcast with Trevor Boehm actually over on Uncivilized, and so I was like, oh, I'm going to go pick up that book, and I did. And I read my way through it, and it was a game changer. So,
awesome.
for people who, a lot of times, I think men don't kind of expect to find like a book by a female licensed therapist that is specifically for them. So, tell me a little bit about what motivated you to write that book, and what it's. I know what it's about, but tell everyone else what it's about.
Yeah. So, it's called Strong, and it's a relationship field guide for the modern man because, as a marriage and family therapist and as a woman in this field, I kind of left the men's work stuff up to the men, right? It's like, there's a lot of men that are doing the men's work, good for them, and I'm just going to focus on the couple, right? And and yet, when I was working with couples, what I would often find is that, I'm the kind of therapist that wants to give resources, right? So we talk for 50 minutes in session, but, a lot of work happens in between sessions, right? When you go home in your real life. And I was always looking for resources to give to couples so that they could do their own work. And I just found that there was so many more resources that were directed to women, for women, about women, by women. And there just wasn't the same amount of resources out there for men. And especially when it came to the topic of relationships, because there is a lot of information out there, for men when it comes to men's work or when it comes to business or when it comes to fitness. There's a lot of, books and podcasts and resources out there about that. But, I was like, gosh, if, I'm working with these men on their relationships and they are hungry, they want they want information, they want skills, they want tools, and there's really nothing out there for them right now. And so I was like, well, shoot, I guess, I'll start writing a book for my clients. And, it started off as like a little booklet, like a little, pamphlet that I would give to my incoming clients. And then, I was like, gosh, I just feel like there's a need for this. So, I went ahead and threw my name in the hat and wrote this book for men.
Well, I have to say it's a really good book. I agree with you that there aren't a ton of resources out there. There's a few other books out there that I found, and they have some good advice, and then there's some that don't have such good advice either. And I think that that's one of the aspects that kind of comes to navigating that field. Now the title is strong, but it's actually an acronym as well, and that's
Mhm.
something that really stood out to me. So can you tell us if you can remember it off the top of your head what that acronym
Yes.
is? I mean, I can remember some of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And so that was something else, in that writing a book for men, what I noticed from a lot of my clients is, men wanted something tangible. They wanted something that made sense, right? Especially if they're, coming into therapy, the field can be a lot of language like, feelings and emotions, which are valid, but having something that could be broken down into kind of blueprint style, I found a lot of my male clients really resonated with that. So STRONG, the acronym, are the 6 pillars of a healthy relationship, kind of banking on that idea that, strong is healthy. Right. And so when we talk about physical health, when we talk about emotional health, when we talk about relational health, strong is healthy. So safety is the first pillar. You have to have a safe relationship in order for it to be a healthy relationship. Trust is the T, which, kind of at the end of the day, if you can't trust your partner in a relationship, what do you really have? The R is respect, which, one of the things that I heard a lot from men in session, but also just in the broader culture, right, is men really need respect to feel loved. And that is such an integral part of feeling safe in a relationship for a man. It's not so much about physical safety, it's really about the sense that they are respected in their home. And again, like you said, sometimes there was some confusing conversations about that, of like, okay, what are we talking about here? And so that's part of why I really wanted to break that down in that chapter, that respect is very important in a relationship, but also how you get that respect really kind of makes the difference between a relationship that's healthy, where you're respected for who you are, versus a relationship that's unhealthy, where you're demanding respect because of your position or your power, right? And so that was something else I really wanted to break down. So STR, safety, trust, and respect, these are the first absolute basic pillars of a healthy relationship. And so many times when I found that people would come into therapy and they were in, constant crisis, or their relationship was just, not in a good place, it was because they were lacking in one of these 3 kind of initial pillars. They were lacking safety, there was no trust, or trust had been broken and not repaired, or they felt disrespected in their relationship. So that's STR, which I call kind of the survival skills of a healthy relationship.
Hmm.
And then the ONG is really kind of the other half of what I saw in therapy, is couples that weren't in active crisis. They were really trying to get ahead of the issue, right? They were like, maybe they were premarital counseling, or they, had been together for a while and they were realizing like, okay, our relationship is good, but we don't want to just fall into a rut. Like, we want to keep growing. We want our relationship to thrive. And so then the ONG is about openness, right? How do you stay open with somebody that you feel like right? Let's say you've been together 25 years. You're like, yep, I know that person. It's like, well, how can you stay open? How can you stay curious? How can you keep the spark alive, right? Nurturing is really, again, about leaving a legacy. How do you nurture your relationships with your children, with your partner, as you go through different life stages? And again, with the conversation for men, is sometimes the idea that nurturing is not part of a masculine skill set is something I heard a lot, and it just didn't match with what I was seeing made successful couples, right? Because in successful couples, both people, regardless of gender, were invested in nurturing their children, nurturing their relationship, nurturing the success of their family, nurturing their legacy. in a way that, kind of transcended gender, right? And also, then when I started doing my research on that chapter on nurturing, I was like, actually, nurturing is a very masculine quality as far as what, back in the day, um, a lot of the fatherhood books were directed for men because they were, you're the father, you're the pillar of your family. Like, what are you going to nurture? How are you going to extend your legacy here? So that was something I've found really fascinating as far as thriving in a long-term relationship. And then the G is generosity, which is kind of like what I call the fairy dust of a healthy relationship. Being generous with your time, your attention, being, giving your partner the benefit of the doubt, looking out for ways to make their day a little bit better. All of those things are kind of just what take a healthy relationship to that next level of feeling like a really, really positive and supportive place to be. So, we got the survival skills, the STR, and then we've got the skills to take your relationship to the next level and help it thrive, the openness, nurturing, and generosity. So that is the strong model.
It's a really good model. I mean, I've read a number of books. Like I've read Mark Manson's models book. I've read the Gottman's books on relationship, and I mean, there's some good stuff there with all of those books. I want to be very clear about that. And yet, I think what I found really insightful and helpful with your book was something that really stood out to me was that you emphasized the importance of cultivating a relationship with yourself first and foremost. And I don't see that in most of the relationship books out there.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, do I feel safe with myself? Do I trust myself? Do I respect myself? Those three chapters in particular really got me to start looking at that. And it helped that I was already kind of going through an online course where I was exploring some of this anyway, but it just added another layer to that. So why is it that men don't necessarily look at that in terms of being safe with themselves, trusting themselves, respecting themselves? Because that seems to be a missing piece in most of these relationship skill books.
Yeah. And what's interesting, and this is part of what I found, is that, a lot of that messaging is just directed to women, right?
Hmm.
There's a lot of um, being safe with yourself, trusting yourself, respecting yourself language and resources for women. And that's part of what I, felt was really unbalanced, is that men were not getting that message. And, obviously there's so much of what we could talk about, but often what I found is it's almost like the objectification and dehumanization of men, right, in our society, going back a long, long time, right? It's like you can't ask men to die for your country. You can't ask men to work themselves into the grave. You can't ask men to hurt their bodies, for businesses, if you don't teach men to kind of disconnect from their own needs a little bit, right? And so, really, that was part of what I saw as kind of informing the messages that was directed towards men. It was kind of missing that piece of, wait, how do we ask men to take care of themselves as human and even acknowledge their own humanity? Rather than just focusing on production value. How do you be better at business? How do you have, a fitter body? How do you lift heavier? How do you, there was a lot of messages that I saw, again, I'm a therapist and kind of looking at it through the lens of like, I'm not really seeing the emphasis on, man as human. And as a therapist, that's always where I want to start, is like, hey, how are you as a person doing, right? Because at the end of the day, as we know, and like I say in my book, you can't be asked to bring safety to the relationship if you've never experienced safety, right? If you've been raised in chaos, or you've had an experience, or if you're suffering from PTSD or unaddressed mental health issues, reading the books about how you need to show up for your partner, like you said, is missing that piece of, wait a minute, how are you showing up for yourself first, right? You can't be part of a healthy relationship if you are not healthy, you know, just first and foremost for yourself, right? So,
Yeah, I mean that was very apparent to me as I was reading it. I'm like, I've done all this work on myself, and I was like, wow, I don't feel safe with myself. I think that was one of the biggest realizations I had reading that book, and it was interesting because I went to a Sacred Sons men's, or it was actually Convergence. It was actually Convergence and I, where they had men and women there.
Okay.
And one of the things I said in this circle was, I don't feel safe with myself. And realizing that I didn't feel safe with myself, so I couldn't possibly expect anyone else to feel safe with me, was a game changer. Because then
Mm,
I started to really examine, like, well, what is it I need to be doing to feel safe with myself? And then I read the next chapter, which was on trust, and I'm like, well, part of the reason I don't feel safe is I don't trust myself. So of course I'm not
yeah.
trusting anyone else. So it made a lot of sense. And
Mm,
it was really fascinating at the same time, because there was just that sense of, yeah, well, I focused on trying to be safe for someone else. I focused on trying I focused on someone else to the exclusion of myself. And then I'm putting all that emotional labor on that person as well, which is one of the points of feedback that a lot of women have is, we're tired of doing all the emotional labor.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I'm really really happy to hear that, and I love that you were able to have that experience, and I'm so grateful to have been part of that, through my book because, I, and again, there's a needed focus on women's needs for safety, right? Like, I mean, that's a very important conversation, but I just didn't like that men's needs for safety were getting lost. It was almost like this, yeah, 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 men feel safe. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like that's just a given. The world is made for men. And it's like, it's actually not. Like, there are a lot of men that don't feel safe with themselves, a lot of men that don't feel safe with other men, a lot of men that don't trust themselves, right? Like, these are very just human struggles. And we need to acknowledge that, you know, one doesn't take away the other, but both need support, right? So, because at the end of the day, it just makes for a better world when everybody can acknowledge, like, okay, what do I need to feel safe? How can I advocate for my needs? And how can I articulate that to my next partner? Right? This is what helps me feel safe. This is what you, as my partner, can do to support that. And then here's where I can take accountability for my own safety needs. Right? So, like you
Yeah.
said, you're not offloading that to your partner. I think.
Well, and I had a very interesting realization recently. I'm actually doing a project right now called the 300 Men Project, where I'm interviewing, the goal is to interview 300 men by the end of 2025. I've
Love
gotten
it.
about 10 of them in so far, so, going to keep at it.
Yeah.
And, but one of the realizations I've had out of those conversations, but also just in reflecting on this myself, and interestingly enough, also from listening to another recent podcast from Traver, was, there's this one saying that men are afraid of being laughed at by women, whereas women are afraid of being hurt or killed by men. And I thought, well, it's not that I'm afraid of being laughed at. I'm afraid of getting broken emotionally and mentally by women. I'm
Mm.
afraid of losing my creativity. I'm afraid of having my heart broken and everything else. And I realized that, and I'm like, I wonder how much of that is a real and present fear. I'm, well, in the process of discovering that, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that. Like, do you feel like there's any validity to that idea?
Yeah, and I think, that to me, what comes up is the recognition of how important relationships are, how healing they can be, but also how absolutely damaging a bad relationship can be, right? Like you said, if in a relationship with somebody who deliberately damages your sense of self, who, um, you know, mocks your creativity, who just, I mean, there's a lot of harm that can happen with a relationship in which you're not seen, you're not acknowledged, you're not supported for who you are. Um, and so I think that is something, again, I always say humans have the capacity for great good and great harm, right? Regardless of who you are, whether you're a man or a woman or whatever, like, we all have the capacity to do harm, and we also have the capacity to help each other heal,
Right.
right? But these are intentional choices that we have to make, and I've seen a lot of men and women too, but if we're speaking about men right now, I've seen a lot of men who have been incredibly broken by their relationships, right? um, and I think this is the other piece that I
Yeah.
really, um, is my goal as a therapist, is to help people again, find that sense of security and safety within themselves so that they never, well, and again, this is where it's a little tricky, but so that they know that they always have the power to write their own story, right? So that nobody else can ever write that story for them about who they are or what they're capable of, right? Um,
Yeah.
and so that also is part of the healing of, like, some of it is healing the narratives or the scripts we got from our parents. Some of it is the scripts or the narrative that we heard from previous partners, right? Is getting to that place where, yeah, none of my value comes from somebody else's valuation of me.
Yeah, it's finding that place of healthy interdependence as opposed to codependence.
Mm-hmm.
I think a realization that I had and was working through already was kind of like, oh, well, here's all the ways that I've abdicated my power. Here's all the ways I've given away my emotional safety, my
Mm-hmm.
respect, my trust, all these other things to other people in the hopes that they would somehow bring that back to me. And one, I want to know how unfair that is to those people because it is. It's
Mm-hmm.
unfair to them. It's putting a burden on them. But
Totally.
two, I think it's also just kind of like, wow, when I started to actually self-resource myself,
Mm-hmm.
that's when I started to find that I showed up in relationships with other people in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't coming at it from a place of neediness. Instead, I was coming at it from a place of genuine celebration and want, but again, not even having to have a yes to that. Like I could accept that no and not take it personally as a form of rejection. So that's kind of
Yeah.
something that stands out to me as well, because it seems like a lot of times one of the challenges that men have is how do they handle no? Like, oh, I've been
Mm-hmm.
told no, and do they take it
Mm-hmm.
personally? So I'm curious as to your thoughts on that, especially with what I just shared.
Yeah. And, you know, I think what you just shared is a very common experience for men, right? Is because that is also something that, part of my perspective is I grew up in a different culture. So when I came to America, I was very just like, I need to understand the dynamics here.
Hmm.
And one of the narratives I kind of saw, especially I'm in the South, is this narrative that, like, if you are a good man, like, the love of a good woman is your reward, right? And that, if you want to continue to perform as a good man, keeping that good woman happy is your job, right? And so it's all about, like, a woman's view of you, the type of woman you can attract determines your goodness as a man, right? Which, again, if you think about it, it's like, gosh, what a disempowering message that your value is solely determined by your romantic partner, right? I mean, that is just, I was like, this is wild. Why are we telling people this? Why are we telling men this? Why are we putting this out there? I mean, there were just so many, in so many small ways, like a young boy who's, like, maybe messy or can't, find his shoes. Like, it starts very young, and they're like, oh, some girl will come along and straighten him out. What he needs is the love of a good woman. And all of these things that kind of subtly kind of take, like you said, take away the power from a man to determine his own kind of sense of being, sense of power, sense of purpose. It all depends on, okay, a woman's valuation of you is what determines your worth, which then, of course, it makes it very personal when a woman turns you down. Right? How could it not? If your whole life you've been taught that your worth is determined by whether or not a good woman chooses to make you her project for life. Right? I mean, so yes, I'm very glad that there are some people that are starting to awaken to that script and how it's very not empowering for men at all.
Right. I don't think it is even remotely empowering. I don't think it helps with the relationships. It puts a lot of pressure on the relationship. And that's one of the other things that really stood out to me is that as I took all this, a look at all this work, I'm like, oh, here's all the ways that I see this kind of pressure being applied, where it's creating this pressure cooker. And neither person is ever able to fully relax into the relationship and just enjoy it. Instead,
Mhm.
there's like this constant sense of I have to work on this relationship, or I have to show
Mhm.
up a certain way, or I have to do other things. And it's always about being for the other person.
Exactly.
But it gets to the point where it becomes very disempowering. And I can easily think of a number of times in my own life where I can see like, oh yeah, that's what I did. So it it kind of comes back to that self-resource. So I will say that as a result of reading your book, along with a few other practices, a practice that I came up with was that in the morning and at night, I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, I like you. I love you. I care about you. I respect you. I trust you. I've got you.
I love that. Ah, that's beautiful. And how has that been for you?
It has helped me feel about 100 times more confident and assertive in my life because I know that at the end of the day, no matter what happens, I've got me. I'm there for me. And so knowing that, I'm not putting it on someone else. And so I'm able to just show up a lot more bolder, a lot happier, and a lot more present. And I'm not relying on someone else to take care of those things. And it's actually making the relationships that I have in general, not just potential romantic relationships, but friendships, my connections with my brothers, other people, or like family, all that. It's making it a lot juicier because I'm just fully present and with myself. And of course, what's really fascinating is I've had a number of people who've been like, there's something about you that's changed. Like, what's going on there? And I'm like, well, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that because it also kind of shows how much love and support is there for the taking, right? It's like you found that, oh, I have all this love, I have all this respect that I have for myself, and I can give it to myself at any point, right? And I can remind myself that, like, gosh, I love me and I have my back, and you know, and I think that's something again when this message that there's love, but you have to cross barriers to get it, or there's respect, or there's support, and you have to do some kind of complicated, you know, measuring yourself up to get this thing when actually it's right there. It's always on tap. All you have to do is open the tap and give it to yourself, right? And again, of course, there's a difference between, having love from a friend or a love from a partner or love from, but there's also just a lot of love and support that is there for the taking from you, right?
that's exactly
Yeah.
it. And it was, and I would say that one of the biggest things that has come out of it is that I've been able to trust myself a lot more because I'm like,
Mm.
well, I'm going to go and do this thing, and it shows up in every area of my life. It's not just about romantic relationships, and I think this is a huge part of what this kind of work can do is that it's not just, oh, well, I'll fix my relationship and that'll be it. Like, no, it's like this can apply to every area of your life and transform the way that you show up. And that's part of what makes life so much juicier and happier as a result.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's so important is, Esther Perel talks about this, that we've lost the village of people that used to be able to, have ourselves reflected in, right? It's like the idea of relationships has gotten so small that it's only a couple, right? And I don't, Esther Perel, I love her work, and she puts things so beautifully, and she talks about how, like, you know now the burden on the romantic relationship is to be the village for your partner, right? And it sets people up for failure because, like, come on, your partner can't be your parent, can't be your grandparent, can't be your best friend and your entire support system and your mentor, and you can't do that for them either. Like, that's just impossible.
Yeah, and I don't want that either. That's the thing. Like,
Exactly.
and it's interesting though. At the same time, so we've been sold on the Disney. I'm gonna
Oh
call it
my
the Disney
gosh.
thing, where it's like you meet this person and it's happily ever after, and they're your one and only, and they take care of every single thing you need, and all that. I'm like, no, like I love having all the friendships that I have. I
Mhm.
love having all the different people in my life, and it actually allows me to celebrate and enjoy the relationships that I'm in that are romantic because I'm not relying on that person or those people to be everything for me. Instead, I'm able to
Exactly.
just take care of and enjoy the things for myself that
Mhm.
otherwise wouldn't occur if I was being putting everything on them.
Exactly. And I mean, how much more expansive then is your life when you're able to say, hold on, like I could have a partner, but I could also have great friendships. I could also have a great relationship with my brothers, excellent relationship with, you know, my friends, my families, my children, and all of those relationships I could be invested in and they could enrich my life. And, you know, I mean, what a buffet, you know? I mean, if we think about it, like the idea of choice, the idea of freedom of choice, the idea of having more options is empowering, is true in so many other areas. And we recognize that that's true in so many other areas. Except somehow, like you said, this Disney idea that like, no, 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 one person has to be your everything. You have to choose just one and that's it forever. you know, if somebody said that about, you can only pick one thing to eat for the rest of your life and that's it. And you have to pick the perfect thing that's going to fulfill you forever. I mean, we'd all be like, no, that's just not,
It's
not a
not going to
thing.
happen. Like at a certain point, I'm just going to get tired of that same thing.
yeah.
I'm going
yeah.
to want something else. No, I mean that is so true. And I mean it's just yeah, it's fascinating like how much that kind of mimetic belief ends up infecting kind of the idea of like what a relationship is or what it can be. And it's like, there are going to be days where I'm going to wake up and I'm not going to be so thrilled with my sweetheart, or there she might not be so thrilled with me or whatever else, and that can be okay. Or there are going to be days where I'm
Absolutely.
just going to want to go out and spend some time with my brothers doing something fun or something like that. And so I think it's really yeah, it's a really important aspect of all this, like how to appreciate and respect the container of the relationship, and at the same
Mhm.
time not put all the stress on it for it to be all the things, because I don't think you can possibly respect the relationship when you're making it be all the things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where people then start to um, have unrealistic expectations of their partner. And then that leads to a lot of resentment. It can lead to contempt, right? It can lead to questioning, like, gosh, you don't fulfill all my needs. Are you really my soulmate? Right. And then looking outside the relationship, which I think that also the other piece of this is, there's a lot of vulnerability in accepting that you might find a partner that you love deeply and they love you and they still can't be your everything, right? And they still may never want to enjoy that thing that you enjoy. They might never share that part of your life with you, right? And so I think there's some real vulnerability and there's some grief. There's some grief or loss of the dream, right? That we've been sold that your perfect person will magically like all the things that you like. They will kind of have that mind meld with you in all aspects, right? And I think that's something I also want to acknowledge for a lot of people. And I talk about it in my couples sessions. It's like, there's grief in that, and that's okay, right? It's like, maybe that fairy tale that you had of that quote unquote perfect person isn't the person that you're married to or isn't the person that you love. And the vulnerability of accepting their humanity, their imperfect humanity, while also kind of recognizing that that's what they're doing for you, right? They're also accepting your imperfect humanity. And that's really where then the growth and the vulnerability in a long-term relationship is saying, you know what, I'm showing up for you the best I can, and I know that it's, there are parts of you that I can't fulfill, and vice versa. And this is not a failure of you, right? And I think this is often that message that men get sent, is that, hey, if there's any part of your life that's unfulfilled or unhappy, it's because you failed as a husband, it's because you failed as a man, right? um, and that also I think is something that I've noticed with men, is like, no, that's not a failure of you, right? Your job is not to be your partner's happiness, right? It's, you can be there for their happiness, you can support them in their happiness, you can sometimes participate in their happiness, but that can't be your whole identity. Otherwise, again, we're back at that very fragile position where when your wife's not happy, your whole identity kind of crumbles, because that's what you've identified as your entire purpose, right?
Yeah, and it's not healthy. I mean, there's something to be said for like being able to say like, okay, I'm gonna prioritize taking care of myself, saying yes to myself, so that when this person has a request, I can honestly evaluate it and weigh it, and then say, and then honor my sacred yes or my sacred no, and know that that person can receive it without being attached to having to the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something else about, like, I think, and you tell me, because I'm really curious about this, and this is something that I've seen. It's, also from a very young age, little boys, they get kind of told, or like, I don't quite know how to put this, but like the superhero, right? It's like they want to be Superman, they want to play G.I. Joe, they want to play the hero, which can be really, I guess, fun, empowering, and all of that. But recognizing that, and I talk about this sometimes with some of the population I work with, because I work with a lot of veterans and first responders, and sometimes their job is being the hero, right? And so also recognizing that, you know, being the hero can be very fun, it can be powerful, it can be empowering, but also recognizing that you also have to be human, you know? Um, yeah.
I think that ties into the idea of the man being the provider.
Mm,
Like I look at it as like there's this emphasis, if certainly traditionally there's been this emphasis on men being the provider financially,
mhm,
and I'm going to acknowledge that women have been providers in other ways when we look at it from a traditional thing. I think that's important to acknowledge as well, and that's
mhm,
shifted a lot. But I think it's kind of like, yeah, there is that sense of like, I want to be the hero of the day. Like, I want to swoop in, I want to show
mhm.
up, I want to be able to show that I can take care of everything, that
Yeah.
I've got all the money, for example, to take you out to that fancy dinner. And then, like I can do all these other things, and you're gonna feel like you're gonna feel so wowed. And this is kind of where I think it's interesting too, is because when we look at this, particularly in the courting phase, like this is a really strong emphasis. Like the man's always courting, you know. But at a certain point, like, okay, we get out of the courting phase. We know the relationship is there. And that's where then the hero persona starts to slip a little bit because it's like, oh, well, I've got this now. And then
Mhm.
it's that fast scramble to then live up to the provider thing, but then it comes out of this place of obligation, which
Uh-huh.
ends up really taking away from the juice of the relationship. So I definitely think there's something at work there, and it's an interesting interplay between provider and hero, where
Mhm.
the provider is kind of the subtle undercurrent, and then the hero is like, well, how do I show up? Here's my brilliant S, because I'm Superman.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, and it's also, again, it's like, Superman was also Clark Kent, right? The opposite of Superman was not, and I guess this is the thing that I mean, maybe this is another book or something, but, the idea that men have this polarity of like, either I'm the hero or I'm the villain,
Hmm.
right? And so that's kind of that narrative, right? There are good guys and there are bad guys, right? The bad guys are the ones that hurt women and that, create evil in the world. And then there are the good guys, the guys that are constantly the heroes, that always swoop in to save, that always save the day, that always are, have that little extra reserve of strength. Um, you know, and this becomes the binary, right? It's like, what kind of guy are you? You the good guy or are you the bad guy? Are you the hero or are you the villain? And really, I think that the like I said, I think we all have the capacity to be heroes and villains, because at the end of the day, we're just human, right? And that encompasses both of these aspects of ourselves, right? People can act in villainous ways, right? Even, that can surprise themselves, which I see people struggle with, right? Like, I love my partner. How was I so mean to them? Right? Or, I wanted to show up for them in this way, but then I chose something else. And I'm confused by that, right? Um, and trying to even make sense of that for themselves. Like, how am I a villain now? Like, am I a bad guy? And then, you know, um, and so again, just kind of coming back to the humanity of like, people are complex. People have the capacity for heroic things, and let's be honest, people have the capacity for some pretty terrible things, and both of those ends, live within us. And being able, especially for men, because more than women, I see this binary presented to men as this is your choice. Are you a hero or are you a villain? There is no human men. It's just you a hero or a villain, right? Um, and women, they don't quite get that messaging to that same degree. Women have different binaries they have to choose from, but this is something I've noticed a lot with the narrative for men. Is like, let's get away from I have to be the hero all the time, otherwise I'm a villain and I deserve to be punished. Or, there's a lot of shame and self-sabotage and self-harm that happens with the villain script, right? It's like men that end up, drinking and hurting themselves and, doing things that are very, very self-destructive or self-destructive, often comes from that place of like, I've done something that I'm not proud of. I didn't act like a hero in that situation. And now I'm struggling with this kind of shame around, am I a villain? Am I one of the bad guys? And so that's something else I'm really passionate about, kind of, especially in the work with men. It's like, these are not the options here, right? In the same way that for women, it's not, Madonnas and whores, right? It's like, they're, at the end of the day, let's just embrace the humanity here. Yeah. Anyway, I
Yeah.
just rambled for a bit.
No, you didn't. I mean, I thought that was really relevant. Like, it's a really interesting thing to explore and recognize that, yeah, there is that hero villain dynamic. It kind of goes to a problem that I actually have with polarity in general. There's a lot of polarity coaching out there and things like that. And I think the problem that I have is that what is kind of given away with that is actually presence.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm really looking for from myself and also from the people in my life is, are you present with me? Are you fully here in the moment? Can you show up regardless of how you're showing up? I mean, recognizing that there can be some things that could be pretty terrible, for example. Being able to own up to those things, being honest about those things, but also being able to celebrate like the light, there's the shadow and then there's the gold. And And I think that that's one of the things that I see lacking a lot of times is there's not a focus on presence. It's like, what do I really want? I want to be present. I want to be aware. Am I showing up with that? As opposed to I have to fit this specific archetype, which may or may not be really where I'm at the time, but it's like there's that pressure again of, well, you got to show up a certain way.
Mm-hmm. And and at the end of the day, kind of, it starts with that self acceptance, right? It's like, if you can't be present with yourself, if you keep trying to run away from parts of yourself that make you, uncomfortable or difficult to look at, if you can't be present with that, then you are always going to be chasing a performance, right? Or you're going to put pressure on yourself that you're going to not want to be present for fear that somebody might see something about you that you're not quite comfortable with yet. So, you know, going to be running away from that. So I think that's also, all leads back to that. Can you accept and be with yourself, um, and love yourself and encourage yourself and challenge yourself and hold yourself accountable? But at the end of the day, being present with where you are, when you are, and who you're with.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's funny, we're kind of coming full circle back to the beginning, and that's perfect. It's that
Mm-hmm.
sense of, can I trust myself enough to be safe with all the aspects of myself, the stuff that isn't so wonderful or great, but is necessarily a part of myself and has valid reasons for being there. And bring some healing to that without necessarily looking for someone else to redeem me or save me. I think that's again kind of an interesting thing with men that I observe and that I've certainly observed about myself is that there's also this very subtle desire to be redeemed and saved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's like I can't do that. I can't have someone else do that. That's something I've got to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which, again, is like, I don't know, the hero's journey. It's like You can't. Nobody else can do that for you, right?
Yeah,
Um, yeah. Yeah, there's so much in this. I love this work, and I love this, these conversations, and um, yeah. And at the end of the day, I'm really glad to hear that, reading my book and obviously all the other work that you've done has, um, impacted you in the way that you engage with yourself, right? Because at the end of the day, like that makes all the difference in how we inhabit our lives, right? It's our relationship with ourselves and
for
all of that.
sure. So there's two final questions here. We've come full circle, and I feel that, and it's been a really good conversation. First question is, where can people find out more about you on the web, and where can they get your book?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at ATX Therapist because I'm in Austin, Texas. If you're in Texas, you're welcome to reach out to me and I can work with you if you are, in the state. Otherwise, you can find my book on Amazon. It's also on Audible. So yeah, that's where people can reach me.
Excellent. And the final question is, and this is something I ask all my guests, can you share with us a final word of wisdom or something along those lines that we can take with us as we move into the day going forward?
Hmm. Whew. Gosh, this is what's coming up for me right now is, believe in yourself and believe in your capacity for growth. I
Mm.
think, yeah, it's like, you know, this is not the end, right? It's believe that tomorrow can be a different day. You can you can grow, you can change, believe in your capacity.
Crystal, I love that. I think that is a perfect way to end this. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on to my show. Thank you for writing the book. It has been a game changer in my life, and I know it can be a game changer for other people reading it. And yeah, just thank you. You are a wonderful, amazing person, and I'm glad that I've
Thank
met
you.
you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear, your experience that just because like I wrote in the very beginning of the book, this book was my like act of love for any man out there who is searching and looking. And so I'm so grateful to hear that it made a difference in your life. So, yay.
Yay.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the work you do for men. I mean, just more voices and giving them resources is part of the change.
Indeed, it is. That is how we all move toward creating a safer world in general for all of us.